this is, I think, our pick for the most technically impressive and also artistically strong game on the Switch. It's Luigi's Mansion 3. Kind of unassuming, right, Oliver, at first, where you're like, you wouldn't necessarily expect this to be the stunner.
Yeah.
But boy, oh boy, when you play this thing and you just see what they're doing with the lighting, the shadows, the model quality, the physics, like everything going on here, it's so beyond what we usually see on Switch that it does genuinely feel like a game designed for a more powerful platform that's somehow running on the Switch.
I think that it's doing a lot of things that we don't tend to see a lot in Switch titles, and that's what part of what makes it so exciting, I think. Like, you have these great materials, good quality pre-calculated lighting in there, but also a lot of really good real-time lighting, which is something you don't tend to see a lot of, with a shadow casting flashlight, SSAO, and even sort of an impression of bounce lighting from that flashlight when you're shining it around, which is just such a cool thing. You don't see that in very many games at all, not just on Switch, but at all. You don't tend to see that too much. And it just all blends together really nicely in the final presentation. The lighting ends up seeming very integrated and kind of very holistic and very interactive in a way that you don't tend to see with a lot of other games. And I think that that blends really nicely with the way that the environmental interaction goes, where you have this vacuum cleaner that you can use to suck up kind of everything in the environment and inhale all manner of cash and gold bars and, you know, tablecloths and all kinds of different things. And the combination of that super interactive gameplay with the vacuum cleaner plus the kind of physical plausibility of the flashlight and shining around the environment and getting this interesting lighting response, it makes for really a great base, I think, to build a plausible game off of, a physically plausible game, and to build the puzzle-solving gameplay, which relies on the physics, and build the kind of action gameplay, which also relies on the physics there as well. And it just ends up feeling like a really beautifully built and well-integrated world in a way that, I mean, you don't really see too often in very many other games. It's just a fun world to interact with and play with and see what happens.
I also think their character rendering is top notch. Like, the way that they handle skin shading in this is more reminiscent of an actual CGI movie versus what we see in basically every other Nintendo 3D realization of Mario and Friends. You know what I mean? It has that soft, like, it's almost like a Fresnel effect, but, you know, on the skin, where like the light sort of like softly plays off the surface of the skin in such a way that it just ends up looking like really, really full and nice.
Yeah.
And of course, it's the same is true of the clothing, and like you said, the materials in general are top notch, shockingly good, in a way it really makes it look like a pre-rendered movie at times, almost, especially if you play in portable mode on like the OLED model.
Yeah.
Like, it just really comes to life. The image quality's so good and everything's so vibrant and just, it's stunning. Really impressive stuff.
And I also just love like the way that they have built all the different hotel floors and the levels in the game.
Yes.
Because like the art looks amazing and each scene is lit in a really compelling and interesting way to kind of catch the eye, and it's just so good. I think that kind of builds up to another point, which is that the game has an interesting approach to the way they've built the game, which is there's no explicit player camera control. The camera just kind of tracks you through each scene. You don't have that kind of right stick camera. Instead, you get the flashlight movement mapped onto the right stick, which I think means that each shot can be designed to look as good as possible from that camera angle and to keep that rendering budget pretty tightly controlled. Because if you look at some of the other games that you might see on Switch that are also visually compelling, like Xenoblade Chronicles 3, it's just totally the other approach, right? Or even in some of the other games we've talked about that are a little bit more limited, they aren't locking it down to that degree. But because they do lock it down to that degree, they're able to build scenes that really maximize the Switch's hardware in like every single frame almost of the experience. And it gives them a lot of that ability to really build something that maybe is not of the Switch so much as you might expect on like a PlayStation 4 and Xbox One in terms of that visual quality. Part of that is keeping that scope more carefully constrained. Not in terms of it being like a small adventure, but in terms of the camera control and in terms of keeping everything very precisely managed.
I love games like this, actually, that sort of manage the camera for you. And I think it can be quite a difficult thing to achieve as well. because you always have to make sure the action is both framed in such a way that the gameplay remains functional, but you also want the game to look awesome. So getting this camera to sort of track around the environments while always framing it in a way that looks appealing, it's not easy. But like you say, it does sort of mean that they only have to worry about what's on the scene at any one point. You don't got to worry about what's behind the camera because the camera will never look that way, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I think
so
that makes
yeah.
some things easier. Like there are a lot of there are a lot of mirrors to the environment. I
Oh
think
yeah, a lot.
I think that approach probably makes it much more plausible to render those mirrors, which otherwise would probably be pretty challenging. And there are like some things that I mean, if I was to just pick things out, it's kind of unfair, but like, you know, the environments are like, they have kind of these rectangular designs to them sometimes. So maybe that gives them a little more of some area to spare on the poly count a little bit. And yeah, like they're not pushing out like any like truly crazy techniques, but they are achieving a lot in terms of the techniques that are there
Right.
and in terms of what they're trying to do that you wouldn't normally see on the Switch. And there's some interesting things in there, like they're using kind of geometric reflections all over the place, like for characters throughout the scenes. They appear to be using some kind of geometric reflection system. And I know that at launch, when we looked at the game, there was some issues with inconsistent frame pacing, which is actually an issue that we see fairly often with some of the more demanding Switch titles. Or at least like in the Doom games, I know that there were some issues there that couldn't quite be cleaned up. But here, actually, I did go back and I did do some performance capture on it, and it is running at a pretty stable 30 frames per second at the moment. There are some one-off frame drops and things like that, but no persistent issues with frame pacing, unlike what we noted at launch. So that is an area where the game has actually improved since 2019.
Yeah. So shout out to Next Level Games for their work here. They've come a long way from NHL Hits Pro Professional. They've done a lot actually with Nintendo over the years. I guess their first joint project was Super Mario Strikers, the football game, soccer game. But I think not only have they done an amazing job here with the visuals, but I think Luigi's Mansion 3 is arguably the best Luigi's Mansion game. I think it's the most interesting one of the bunch. They really figured out how to make a truly compelling sort of puzzle exploration game. And the different floors of the hotel with all those different themes lend it a ton of variety that I would say the other games didn't really pull off. You know, I mean, Dark Moon tried to fix that with multiple mansions. And the original game was fairly constrained, but this one is just so much more interesting visually in terms of like when you go into a floor and it's like, there's like covered with like grass and vines and everything's overgrown, and you're just like, what the heck?
Or like one is like a movie studio, one is like this medieval themed thing. You go to the boiler room, you go to the basement, you go to like an art studio, all kinds of different.
There's that flooded area where you're like going around on the raft and it's got all this beautiful reflection.
Oh yeah,
using the vacuum to sort of like blast yourself around in the water. Plus the Guigi stuff.
Guigi, of course.
I think that's a great addition to the game. And that's sort of like splitting the two characters to go achieve different things to let the characters through is a really smart sort of thing for puzzle-based games like this. It works really well. So, man, really, really, really solid game from these guys. So great work on that. And definitely, I think we both agree, the most technically accomplished and just like perfectly polished example of this on the Switch.
Yeah, and it really is kind of in a class of its own. I don't really think there's another title that kind of comes close to this in terms of achieving this much within the constraints of the Switch. Like some of the other games we've talked about so far are very impressive in their own right, but this is like doing something that's very unique in terms of its artistic design, in terms of its scope, in terms of combining all these techniques in there and getting a game that does look like something that could have been, you know, a great looking game on a much more powerful platform. It just kind of is up there in terms of its overall visual design, in terms of the way that it's built. It's just a super impressive looking game that kind of exceeds the Switch in some respects. You know, it does not look like it should be running on a Switch.
Yeah, and as you suggested, the fact that they're using all these techniques is one thing, but the fact is that they've taken these techniques and made something that looks visually outstanding. Because a lot of times just implementing this stuff, especially on Switch, doesn't necessarily mean you get great results or that it will look that good in motion. But here, everything has its place. They didn't just throw a bunch of technology at this game just because for technology's sake, right? They very specifically picked things that they wanted to use in order to enhance the presentation. And it's all addition rather than subtraction. And I think that works really, really well here. So great job, Next Level Games.